Welcome. This is Common Ground, and I'm Jason Downs. Welcome to a place where we can all agree on the important stuff, like having the ability to make the smartest, most well-informed, and most beneficial decisions for ourselves, as though we could think like a lawyer. Our guest today has written a book about just that. So stick around for a stimulating conversation with former Assistant U.S. Attorney, law professor, and author Kim Whaley. Today is February 28th, and I'm so glad you've joined us here on Common Ground. Here's to a great show, a great day, a great week for all. Our show is sponsored by Denny & Company, LLP, certified public accountants. They make your life less taxing at dennyllp.com. And the law offices of Lou Espin. When experience counts, count on experience at espinlaw.com. Kim Whaley is an author, a lawyer, a law professor, and a legal expert. She has served as a legal analyst for CBS News. She's a regular guest on MSNBC, CNN, BBC, NPR, has appeared on Fox News, C-SPAN, PBS. Whaley is a contributor to Politico, The Atlantic, The Bulwark, The Hill, and has written for the Baltimore Sun, the LA Times. She's a former assistant U.S. attorney, associate independent counsel in the Whitewater investigation. She has authored the books How to Read the Constitution and Why, What You Need to Know About Voting and Why, and How to Think Like a Lawyer and Why, which is the book we're going to be discussing today. And Kim, I just want to thank you so much for being on the show again. It's always an honor and a pleasure to have you.
I'm so happy to be here, Jason. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So we have talked about how to read the Constitution and why, and what you need to know about voting and why. So this is your third sort of installment, if you will, in that series. Why did you think it was so important to go from the Constitution to voting and now to thinking like a lawyer?
Well, Constitution, the first book, was really about civic literacy and seeing things in the newspapers and on the news and in common discussions that were just basically inaccurate about how our government actually works. And it's not the fault of regular Americans. It's just not taught, not even in terms of the basic ABCs of the Constitution, but the why part. You could see that's the theme in all the books. Mm-hmm. And when I got done with How to Read the Constitution and Why, even after teaching law and doing research in law for 16 years plus, it dawned on me that voting is really the heartbeat, the heart and soul of American democracy and the Constitution itself. The Constitution is only a piece of paper. It needs to be enforced. And the way it's enforced, for people that are violating the norms and the standards and the rules in the Constitution is at the ballot box. That's how we hire and fire political actors to act on our behalf. And so it's like, wow, you can't understand the Constitution unless you understand voting. So that was book number 2. And then after the last election, and of course, I was in the midst of writing this book, but, the January 6th carnage and this, sort of lying about the legitimacy of the work that thousands of people did in the election, regular people, to make that election run smoothly and fraud-free. I said, well, what's really going on more deeply in American culture that we can't respect the Constitution and voting if there's something else there? And that's book number 3. I realized after doing all this teaching of law students that, law students come into law school looking for answers and having positions. This is my position. I was a debate I was on the debate team. Right. I'm supposed to support this position. Lawyers ask questions. And so it's a methodology, a skill set for people to get out of black and white thinking and start getting a little more methodical and careful and productive, frankly, in how we address important issues in our lives.
I loved the book for that very reason. I think it's such an important topic, and obviously, look, I mean, lawyers often aren't like other people, right? I mean, they think differently, and that's your entire premise of the book. They see the world in a way that those of us who are not lawyers often don't. You've been a lawyer for 20 years. You've been teaching law for 15 years. So talk about why it's so important that we learn, non-lawyers learn to think like a lawyer. You just touched on it, but
Because
let's dive in.
yeah, yeah. I mean, I have a 5-step process, as you know. And first of all, thank you for the kind words about the book. I break down. We do it in law school, but I've done it differently for sort of non-law students. I break down legal thinking into 5 steps. I call it BICAT. And it is different, as I said, than how we normally think because it's about questions. It's about nuance. It's about gray areas. Where are the arguments on both sides? Where's the friction in this issue? That's what lawyers are like bloodhounds. That's what we look for. And when we find it, you can't stick with one position. You have to turn the coin over. You have to gather as much information as you can, sort through the good from the bad, exhaust your opposing counsel's arguments in your own mind, and then present the best position you can on behalf of your client. And we don't do it because, we're sort of, ethically better or sort of more modest than others or whatever. It's because if you don't do that, you will lose. If you don't do that, you will be reversed on appeal by a higher court. If you don't do that, you could even be sanctioned or disbarred. We saw this with the last election. Sanctions out of Michigan against the Kraken lawyers, Rudy Giuliani, kicked out of 2 states because if you blow through the rules of lawyering, you can get in trouble. So there's a lot of accountability there. And the other piece, and I know we'll talk about this, I think it evades a lot of people, Jason, that laws are really about a value system. I mean, what do we value? We value life. So we have anti-murder laws. In theory, we could not have those. Lawyers have to think about a value system. And I think that's something we've lost in our common discourse again. We put our values at the door when it comes to politics and these kind of polarizing issues. And my argument is, listen, that same value system that you apply to your kids, to your family, to your church leaders, to your teachers, to your colleagues, that applies on the broader scale even more importantly. And this book tries to sort of slow everything down, slow our thinking down, so that we can go back to our core humanity and our common sense.
Well, and it seems like the key to that is something you just touched on, which is really developing that skill to see an argument or make a decision based on more than just my side, right? More see things from multiple perspectives and take that time, like you just said, to really understand both sides before taking a position and or making a decision, right? I mean, is that
absolutely?
Not trying to oversimplify, but
no, it's true. And it seems like, you might hear this and say, I do that. But we actually, all of us don't on a lot of the time. And in the book, I mean, I'm no scientist, but the book walks through some research, scientific research on decision making. And we are well tuned to be reactive to danger and something that's exciting. And our bodies get flooded with hormones, and we get triggered either emotionally positively or negatively to react. And that's good. That's kept the human species alive for millennia, right? But when it comes to issues like I talk about in the book around marriage and divorce and custody questions, or how to respond to the nasty gram from your boss, or do you take that healthcare step? Of course, we just got through a pandemic, lots of divisiveness around vaccines and things. That kind of reactive decision making isn't great. It takes 20 to 30 minutes for the hormones to leave our bodies and get out of that fight or flight reactive response state. That's why people that want to sell you something want to make the deal. They want to close the deal in the 20 minutes that you're excited about their pitch. They know if you walk away and think about it, you're going to settle down and might realize it wasn't the right decision. It's that second kind of decision making that not only am I encouraging through the book, but I'm telling you exactly how to do it. I mean, lawyers, law students spend a lot of money. It's hard to get into law school. It's a grueling process. The first semester actually, knocks everybody down. It's like boot camp. I don't care how smart you are, what law school you've gone to. It's really tough, and it's tough for a reason, because it's rewiring brains to look for questions and not answers. And then, as you indicate, Jason, when you identify the questions, to really dig deep into all elements and nuances of that question. And, when it comes to big decisions in our lives, we want that same kind of care, I think. If it matters for our families, for our futures, it's better, I think, to be more methodical. And so I try to bring some of those skills to everyone's living room, frankly.
This is a quote from the book. Lawyers look for the nooks and crannies of a problem that has no clear answers and craft a series of possible responses or approaches. It's an entirely different way of thinking than jumping to a conclusion or a side, quote unquote, and finding arguments to support a preconceived point of view. That's a direct quote from Kim Whaley here in her book, How to Think Like a Lawyer and Why, A Common Sense Guide to Everyday Dilemmas. So, look, I mean, you also say, this is another quote, making good decisions is a critical component of having a happy and fulfilling life. So, I felt like these two quotes kind of sum up a lot of the book for me. So this idea, okay, and we're all guilty of this, right? Of finding arguments to support a preconceived point of view that we have, and we base our decisions, based on that, base our decisions on that sort of thing quite a bit. So one of the things that you talk about, you touched on some of the scientific research behind, some of these things, the way that lawyers are trained to think this way and make decisions this way and research this way. One of the things you bring up is the field theory, right? So in 1972, Irving Janis called it groupthink, right, to describe this sort of team decision-making type of thing that we find ourselves involved in quite a bit, where the 10 people before us choose this or think this way, and so we can't help but be influenced by that, right? And it's done hastily, like you said. We often don't take that step back. We're caught up in the excitement of the moment, whether it's 20 minutes, 30 minutes, whatever that you said that our brains need to sort of calm down and step away. But I feel like I want to lead this into the next thing that comes along with that. And again, your book follows this sort of normal track that human beings find themselves on. The next thing there is this gut decision type of mentality. So we've got this group decision kind of mentality. We've got this gut decision mentality, and we do these things often without even thinking about it or realizing, that we're doing it. And the thing about gut decisions that you point out so succinctly is that people seem to admire gut decisions. They find them courageous. They find them confident, but they're still made with very little information, right? So this takes us into heuristics, right, which are mental shortcuts that we take as people, as human beings, to make decisions when we have very little information. And mental shortcuts bring us to cognitive biases that we often don't even know we have. They're built in, right? Like belief biases, hindsight bias, omission bias, and the one we're seeing so much these days, and can't help but fall victim to, confirmation bias. So, like you say that a lot of this has to do with brain chemistry, right? Like many things that human beings struggle with. But once we become aware and train ourselves to behave or think differently, then we can improve ourselves and our lot in life by making better decisions. So anyway, I didn't mean to go off on so much there, but I just loved that track that you sort of laid out for us in how human beings tend to make decisions often. And you just described how difficult it is to untrain yourself. And so when you go to law school, you sort of are untraining all of this habitual way of making decisions. And
exactly.
Anyhow, so yeah, if you want to comment on that, I'd love to hear you delve deeper. But yeah, I think all of that leads to where we find ourselves today. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. I mean, you covered so much of it, Jason. I appreciate it. I've actually talked about the book a few times now, and I really am excited about the research, and that isn't something that a lot of people so far have put their finger on. And I put it in there because I just want people to understand this isn't my opinion, right? I'm not trying to be judgmental.
Right.
This is the science, and our both brains. We're basically, we're a species that evolved over a long time, and we evolved to as you indicated, to have this confirmation bias, to have these gut decision making instincts because we had to survive. And I'm not saying those are bad things that we need to run away from. I'm just saying sometimes we rely on them when and we think that it's a helpful way or the best way, and it's simply not. I want to get back to your point though about this idea of groupthink, and we might have heard of that. There's a really fascinating sort of experiment that I talk about in the book in the 1950s called the ASH experiment, ASCH. And a group of people were given 3 lines, and I have it in the book, literally 3
Yes.
vertical lines, A, B, and C. And there were 9 people, say, in the experiment that were
Each one a different length.
in on the secret, right?
Right.
And they were asked which, and they were giving a new line. And so if you have line A, B, and C, then you get D, which does line D match? And the first 9 people chose the wrong thing to match it with. It was obvious that they weren't the same length. Number 10, more cases than not, when they did this experiment, the 10th person chose the wrong answer, even though you could see that it didn't match up because the 9 people before that person chose that answer. So this just shows us how our brains, we want to belong. We're persuaded by what others believe. And I mean, my view in part on sort of debunking or unpacking some of this for people outside of the elite law school environment is that it's empowering to have new skills. That is part of why we're so, I think, into groupthink is because there's safety in numbers and because it makes us feel like we belong somewhere. We feel confident. We feel empowered if we're on a team. And that's a wonderful thing, and I don't want to suggest that's uniformly bad. It's great. But what I'm saying is here's a new way you can feel empowered with these skills that sort of outmaneuver some of these reactive, automatic things that our brain does by naming them, by seeing them. And I have worksheets in the book. I have this, as I mentioned, a 5-part test that anybody can sit down at their kitchen table, go through my process. You might go back to your reactive, knee-jerk sort of initial instinct. That's fine. But part of what I'm trying to convey is when you do that, you might feel better about it. You might, even if you don't sort of get everything you want, or if people are challenging your Me Too groupthink reactive, or I should say confirmation bias, all of those things, you can feel better about that decision because you've unpacked it. And one of the key elements that I have in my 5-part test is to really name your own value system, because decisions, often the harder ones, just like in law, right? Every 5-4 opinion on the Supreme Court means there are really good arguments on both sides. And when it comes to thorny, big, overwhelming decisions in our lives, they're mostly gray. You list the pros and the cons. But what I suggest is if you identify really clearly on paper, write down your value system. What matters to you? Is it getting through this as quickly as possible? Is it maximizing your financial outcome here? Is it protecting your children's health? Whatever it is, depending on the issue, if you name that early in the process, then however it comes out, if the outcome matches up with what matters to you in terms of your value system, you're going to feel okay about it. And that also gets us out of this polarized political thinking because we're checking in with our own sense of what matters to us.
We're talking to tenured professor of law at the University of Baltimore School of Law, where she teaches and writes about the constitutional separation of powers, administrative law, civil procedure, Kim Whaley, author of How to Think Like a Lawyer and Why. And the 5 test, the 5, I guess, stage test that she's talking about in decision making is she shortens to BICAT, which stands for B, break down the problem. I, identify your values, which you were just emphasizing, which I'd love to talk about as well, because you get into that in lots of detail. Name your aim, like you just said. What's your aim, or ultimate value or goal in this decision? Number three, C, would be collect as much knowledge as possible. And you go into that in detail in the book, and how to collect reliable knowledge, which I think is so important these days. And then number four, A, argue both sides of each point, which we touched on earlier in the conversation. That's a step that most of us skip, when we're making a decision, for sure, right? That lawyers
Yep.
tend to, obviously have to master, right? This idea of arguing both sides. And then finally, T, tolerate the fact that some will disagree with you and that you might feel conflicted, which I think is another really interesting thing that doesn't often factor into our decision making. So, look, you talk about. Let's see where I had a note here. Okay, you distinguish between standards of information that are put out by politicians and standards of information as it relates to the judicial system and law, right? And the kind of information that lawyers have to rely upon, as opposed to the standards that say politicians hold themselves to. So one of the reasons I think that this book is so important right now is that as a nation, we've lost faith in folks' ability to think logically and make wise decisions, right? Especially as it pertains to civic duty, right? And again, this is something you go into lots of detail in the book. Do you believe that if we all thought more like lawyers, that this would solve a lot of those issues?
Well, I think it'd be a step in the right direction. And let me just say, I came of age in, pre-internet really. And the goal of my K through 12 education in part was to find information. I mean, I grew up with 5 kids in my family in Buffalo, New York, and the dog-eared encyclopedia that we got from the
Oh yeah.
grocery store.
Oh yeah.
Every month we got a new volume. That's where we got most of the information for a paper or research we would do. And if we were really ambitious, we'd go to the library, we'd pull out the card catalog, we'd get on microfiche, all of that. Now the paradigm is flipped. That is, we have so much information coming through our phones, TV, computers. It's overwhelming. We don't know how to sort it. And frankly, it's not neutral in that it's not easily accessible to everybody. And it's being tailored to talk about confirmation bias. Some algorithm is trying to confirm our biases through what it's tailor-making and giving to us through Facebook or whatever it is.
Yes.
So, lawyers, as you indicate, we've got what are called the federal rules of evidence in the federal courts, and every state court has rules of evidence. It's a gatekeeper to getting information to juries. Most people have heard of hearsay. There actually are exceptions to hearsay. It's not like all hearsay, that is third-hand or second-hand knowledge, isn't allowed in front of juries. But the idea is, listen, we don't want inaccurate or unverifiable information going to juries, because somebody's life could be on the line, somebody's liberty could be on the line in the criminal context. We want to make sure they only get information that we are 100% sure is verifiable, and then they can make a decision based on what we feel comfortable is good information. And so lawyers have to learn how to get through those wickets and get out over those hurdles. They're trained to look behind what's told them or told us, to see if it comes from a good, credible source. Because if it doesn't, and they can't what we call authenticate it, they're not going to get it in front of a judge or a jury.
Yep.
So I think we need, in 2022 and moving forward, we need to train ourselves and our kids how to manage the information overload and sort through the garbage and get to good information, just like lawyers do. We need our de facto, at-home rules of evidence for ourselves. And I do think if we could get to some kind of common principles about what's good information and what isn't, and the fact that there does exist good information. I mean, Jason, we've undermined that notion, this idea of alternative facts,
Right.
and our experts have expertise, all of that. 30 years ago, it was common information, right? People read the New York Times, they read the Washington Post, they
Well,
watched, CBS News or whatever. Now we don't have a common set of facts. So I do think, Jason, we have to go back to these first principles of education to get through this polarized mess that we're in right now politically
agreed.
and frankly, socially.
Let's take a quick break, and we'll talk a little bit more about that when we come back. We're going to talk about the fairness doctrine and the FCC, which touches on what you just mentioned, Kim. And we're also going
Yep.
to talk about how we can think like Ted Lasso, which I read between the lines in Kim's book as well. So stay with us right here on Common Ground, KHTS 98.1 FM and AM 1220.
It's murder, mystery, and mayhem at the Canyon Theater Guild. Usher in the new year with laughter and mystery at the hilarious comedy Whodunit, Clue on Stage. Was it Miss Scarlet in the kitchen with the wrench? Perhaps it was Mr. Green in the billiard room with the rope. Only one way to find out. Based on the popular board game and adapted from the cult classic film, Clue on Stage will keep audiences guessing and laughing to the very end. Get your tickets by calling 661-799-2702 or online at canyontheater.org.
This is Bradley from Santa Clarita Grocery, the all-volunteer grocery program serving children, families, and individuals experiencing food insecurities. Since January 2020, Santa Clarita Grocery has distributed 83 tons of fresh groceries to 4,465 families in the SCV. Santa Clarita Grocery is a drive-up, drive-through service with physical distancing in place to continue serving our community. If you are in need or looking for a charity to do the most good for our community, please consider partnering with us by donating to Santa Clarita Grocery, one of the most efficient charities in the Santa Clarita Valley. A full 99 cents out of every dollar goes directly back to the community. Santa Clarita Grocery operates on a 1% overhead and is sustained through private donations. Santa Clarita Grocery is at 21176 Center Point Parkway in the Oasis Furniture parking lot. Please visit our website, santaclaritagrocery.org, or Facebook at Santa Clarita Grocery to make a difference in our awesome town community. 661-425-7575. Be our guest and experience the difference.
Your hometown station, KHTS.
Welcome back. This is Common Ground. I'm Jason Downs. So great to have you here. We are speaking to Kim Whaley. She is a tenured professor of law at the University of Baltimore School of Law, where she teaches and writes about the Constitution, about voting, about how to think like a lawyer. Her most recent book is called How to Think Like a Lawyer and Why, and we have covered a lot of ground today, and we're so grateful to have her here. She has been talking about how information has changed over the since we were kids, right? And how much more difficult it is to discern what is quality information and what is not. So one of the things I wanted to bring up that I read in your book that I found staggering was to do with the FCC and the fairness doctrine, which was in place and related to news media and other organizations and the kind of information that they were allowed to disseminate. And there had to be some truth to it. It needed to be true, right? And it governed sort of how media was relayed. Now, what blew my mind was that the fairness doctrine was abolished by the FCC in 1987. And I think that that's indicative of where we are today. And I wanted to know I just wanted to hear more about what you learned about that and what you know about that, Kim.
Right. So here's a place where I think law is helpful, right? We have laws. Laws are out there to govern people's behavior and to push back against really our worst instincts. I mean, this is why we have a constitution, so that politicians are held accountable. So the fairness doctrine was something that it was a policy that was put in place by the federal government, the Federal Communications Commission, back in 1949. And the FCC is what licenses broadcast journalism. So back then, I guess it was radio, then maybe television, internet, cable, etc. You have to get various licenses from the Federal Communications Commission in order to broadcast things. The FCC said, okay, we'll give you a license, but on a condition that you present controversial issues of public importance in a manner that fairly reflects different viewpoints. So it can't be one note. It can't be one-sided. And that, I think, is, it was kind of a filter. It was a gatekeeper for information that goes to the public. And as you indicated, the FCC got rid of that. And, we are where we are. I think with certain cable channels, Fox News in particular, frankly, just having no limits on the kind of information that it presents, and with an agenda, right? So this is one of the most important things, I think, that people need to understand when it comes to politics and media in this moment, with certain media, not all media. That is that everybody's motivated by something, and these folks are not motivated by informing the public in a fair manner so the public can make good decisions on their own or good voting decisions. The framers of the Constitution understood, and anyone who's seen, Hamilton, the musical, might agree with this. The framers understood it's human nature. If you give people power, they'll amass it, they'll entrench it, and they'll ultimately abuse it. And that information is power. Information is knowledge, and knowledge is power. And so there were rules put in place to manage people's worst instincts. And given that was gotten rid of around the same time that the internet exploded, and just so people understand, there's another legal principle in which early on with the internet, the argument was if I have a website, or if I'm posting on, say Facebook, for example, that I'm just a bulletin board, like at somebody's community center.
Right.
That you can't hold me accountable for the information that's on my site because I'm just a bulletin board. Well, we know these days that's not the case, right? They sort the information. They prioritize the information. There are algorithms.
They manipulate it.
Yeah. They manipulate the information. So there's no tickets for speeding because there's no red lights anymore when it comes to the garbage that comes in our brains and in our phones and in our children's brains and their phones. And so that's, as you indicate, that's step 3 of my 3-part framework is collect knowledge. And I use knowledge very carefully. I mean, knowledge means good stuff. It's like spinach for your brain, right?
Right.
We have to train ourselves to do it because the government's not doing that for us, not making sure that it's only good stuff that gets in our brains anymore.
And one of the ways that you illustrate that is what I interpreted as a Ted Lasso approach, because you talk about in some of your law classes how you encourage your students they in fact require them to read an editorial or an op-ed on both sides of an issue before coming in
Right.
and talking about it. And so, it reminded you talk about how law students are taught to be curious rather than focus on outcomes. So the emphasis is on curiosity rather than outcomes. And I just couldn't help but think of the Ted Lasso episode where he talks about how he was taught to be curious, right? Anyhow, he's playing darts. I don't know if you've seen it, but it's a lovely little piece. Anyhow, I love that because so often now, and this goes back to what we've talked about already about confirmation bias and all the biases that we come, that we're packing as people, right? It comes back to that as well because they often prevent us from being curious about the other side and approaching things like a lawyer would and doing our research and making sure our information is solid and then looking at an issue from both sides before making a decision.
Right. I love the Ted Lasso analogy. I've never put that together. I might borrow it from you going forward because, listen, I mean, we all know Ted Lasso has captured people's hearts across America, across the globe, across the political spectrum. There's something he's doing that we long for, that we love, that feels good to us. And one thing Ted Lasso doesn't do is alienate and reject and shame people for coming into his life in ways that maybe he doesn't agree with or even are a little bit hurtful for him or are hard for him. And even in that class that you mentioned, these are upper-level law students. This is not first-year law students. And it was during a semester where it really hit me, where I was on CBS covering Trump's first impeachment, very polarized stuff. We're talking about the Constitution, and at the end of the semester, as you said, I said, come in with 2 points of view, and you have to sort the sources, and I taught them how to sort the sources. And they said, listen, Professor Whaley, this is the first time we've ever felt safe coming to the table with a competing point of view, because we're so worried that we are going to get attacked and alienated and shamed. I mean, these are my words. But I did a roundtable of about 30 students, and it really hit me like, wow, our youth don't have this skill. They don't know what it's like to not be on the defensive all the time, right? And that's a very different mindset than curiosity, like you indicate.
And that is a Ted Lasso kind of mindset, right? Where he creates a safe environment where he is wrong sometimes, which goes to your fifth, where you can tolerate the fact that that sometimes you'll be wrong or you won't win or people will disagree, right? He doesn't seem to be afraid of that, right?
Right.
And is willing, and he's at least very open and curious about all sides, and then comes up with the most beneficial or best decision for all involved, right? So anyway, I'm just trying to circle some of those things back to, but
Yeah, he's tolerant, he's patient, he takes a few minutes, he noodles through things, but I have the tolerance at the last step, but it could really be the first step. And that, if we're in this defensive fight or flight, I'm right, you're wrong. I've identified now with my position because I staked it out early. So if you challenge my position, you're challenging me. I mean, all of this is happening, Jason, in our brains, and we're not even aware of it. Exactly. This is what's happening, right? And then meanwhile, we're losing sight of what's really best for ourselves and our family because we're so in this death throes of right versus wrong, right? But if we start out saying, you know what, the right thing for me, the win for me is to adhere to my value system. And that's what Ted Lasso does, right? I care about my integrity. I care about,
I care about your integrity.
Empowering people. Go ahead. What?
And I was just saying he cares about your integrity too.
And your integrity too. Yeah. He'll say, these are my value systems. This is my lighthouse. This is my light in the darkness. And if I adhere to that, then I can feel good about the outcome, even if I alienate or, unwittingly and not meaningfully. Some people don't feel good about the fact that I took this stand, but I know for myself this is my stand. It's not red stand, it's not blue stand, it's not this team stand or that team stand. Mm-hmm. This is how I live my life, and the benefit of it, Jason, is if you start going that direction, other people will follow along and will kind of want part of that energy. And the irony, honestly, is that we're talking about lawyers, right? Lawyers are perceived in our culture as fighters, as antagonists, as nitpickers. But what dawned on me through teaching these students in this very polarized time of our society is that the legal method is actually the opposite. I mean, when they're in court, they have to fight, but it's what they did before they got to court. Lawyers, it's the spade work they did to get to that trial that is Ted Lasso-esque, I would say, in that it's methodical, it's thorough, it's careful, it's fact-based, it's rules-based, and it's even value-based. I mean, you sit down with your client and say, listen, we can go this direction, but this is the price you're going to pay if you want to do it that way, right? Or you could lose this, but if you do it this way, you'll save some fees or you'll save some heartache or whatever. Lawyers will put all the options out on the table, allow the client to make the decision, but it's the lawyer's job to kind of hash through the good, the bad, and the ugly, and we don't tend to do that in our own lives anymore.
There's so much more that I would love to ask you. I know that you've given us about as much time as you can. We're talking to Kim Whaley. She's an author, journalist, former assistant U.S. attorney. She is a practicing attorney. She is a law professor, and she has written 3 fantastic books: How to Read the Constitution and Why, What You Need to Know About Voting and Why, and How to Think Like a Lawyer and Why, which is what we've been talking about today. You can follow her at Kim Whaley. That's Whehle, Kim Whaley. on Twitter and Instagram and many other places, I'm sure. You can buy her book on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Kindle, in your local bookstore. I encourage you to go out and read this book by a very, very smart woman who we should be listening to. Um, it's so much more I would love to ask you, but
Well, we should do it again.
I'll-
We should do it again.
I'll- I'll
Ted
just
Lasso-esque.
I'll just have to have you back.
Okay.
All right. Look, thank you so much, and all the best to you, and best of luck with the book, obviously. And we'll look forward to having you next time. So,
Thank you, Jason, and thanks to your listeners for giving me their time in hearing about this. And I do hope I hope people find some value in it, and really enjoyed the chat.
I certainly did too. All right. So stick with us here on Common Ground. We'll be right back. KHTS 98.1 FM and AM 1220.
Time for a car wash, but fearful of the scratches that go along with it? Canning Car Wash and Valencia Car Wash proudly use 100% lamb's cloth to prevent scratches and provide the best wash possible. Both locations use environmentally friendly solutions to wash and wax your vehicle, and they both accept all other car wash coupons. Give your vehicle the wash it deserves. Visit Canning Car Wash on Soledad across from Edwards Cinema, or Valencia Car Wash on Creekside Road behind Target.
No words can describe the power of belonging to a group of close friends or being part of a family. Insight Treatment Center was founded more than 20 years ago to give teenagers a community of friends and family as they overcome issues like depression, anxiety, and trauma. The new Santa Clarita location is a COVID-secure environment where distance and good airflow are a priority. As a leader in providing intensive outpatient treatment to teenagers, Insight Treatment Center in Santa Clarita is here to help. Call 888-295-9995 or go online to insighttreatment.com.
I listen to it all day, every day.
Hometown, your hometown station.
Welcome back. This is Common Ground. I'm Jason Downs. Welcome to a place where we can all agree on the important stuff, like making good decisions. I hope you enjoyed the conversation with Kim Whaley as much as I did. Always a pleasure to have her here. Have you seen Ted Lasso, Patty?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah?
Oh, Ted
Okay.
Lasso. No, he's great. Jason Sudeikis is amazing.
It's such a great show.
It is.
In so many ways.
And sportsy. And I love sports,
And
too.
sportsy. Yeah, no, of course. I mean, added bonus. That's what I'm saying. It ticks so many boxes.
It does.
And it does it so well. And it's really, I don't know if people even realize how difficult it is to create a comedy
Right.
that still has such depth and speaks to so many different things in a positive way.
Yeah.
And speaks to so many people in a positive way.
I like to view it as like an intellectual comedy in a way. Like, is there
Yeah.
I've made like a subgenre of like my own personal subgenre of there's like these, you're starting to kind of see these comedies where they're smart. It's like ooh, there's a double entendre. It's like, oh no, that's they don't go for low hanging fruit, so to speak.
You're absolutely right.
And I'm starting to
it's
see
making me a
that.
better person to watch this.
Yeah.
Oh wow, how interesting is that?
Yeah, no, seriously, right.
I mean, no, you're absolutely right. I like that. I can't say enough about that show. I think that it was truly, and the timing was so wonderful because we needed something like that. I feel like, you know, something so
totally
just unabashedly positive and intimate, even, you know, raw in a way. It's so interesting. I can't say enough about it. Anyhow, so wanted to talk about a few things that happened on this day in history because you know how much I like that.
You are a history buff, Jason.
I also just think it helps us frame where we are and, you know, to look back, see where we've come from,
Yes.
you know. So interesting thing. On this day in 1987, Gorbachev,
Mm.
Mikhail Gorbachev, who
Mikhail
was
Gorbachev.
who was the head of the USSR at that time,
Uh-huh.
calls for a nuclear weapons treaty. He actually was the impetus for. I mean, he'd been talking to Reagan. They'd had many talks.
Right.
But in a surprising announcement on this day in 1987, Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev indicates that his nation is ready to sign without delay, those were his words, a treaty designed to eliminate U.S. and Soviet medium-range nuclear missiles from Europe.
Interesting.
And it led to breakthrough negotiations, obviously. And anyhow, I just feel like, given what's been happening over the past days, that's perspective, because right now we're dealing with a leader who obviously thinks very differently than Gorbachev in some ways.
Yes.
And I don't know. I mean, this feeling that we've taken a step backward is hard to shake sometimes.
A little bit, yeah.
And it's so sad to see what people are going through. For what? You know what I mean? I mean, so what? What?
What?
He's going to get a little more power than he has now. I mean, for what?
I know.
Anyway, Patty, I thought you could explain all this to me, but clearly you're not in a giving mood today. I'm kidding. I'm kidding.
I must apologize, Jason. I am not the brokerage of peace. I do not have my pulse on otherworldly affairs.
Another interesting thing happened on this day in 1953.
Mm-hmm.
Cambridge scientists James D. Watson and Francis Crick announced that they've determined the double helix structure of DNA. The molecule containing human genes. So these molecular biologists, they were aided significantly by the work of a woman researcher named Rosalind Franklin. She unfortunately had ovarian cancer and died before she could be acknowledged and, knew that her work had influenced, the world in such a way. But anyhow, we're giving her credit now.
Right.
Rosalind Franklin, along with Dr. Watson and Dr. Crick. They won the Nobel Prize. So on the morning of this day, in 1953, they determined the structure of DNA was a double helix polymer, the spiral that we've all come to know, right? Each containing a long chain of monomer nucleotides wound around each other. And according to their foundings, DNA replicated itself by separating into individual strands, each of which became the template for a new double helix. So anyhow, Crick explained in his book later on, years later when he wrote a book about it, he announced the discovery by walking into the nearby Eagle Pub in Cambridge and blurting out that we have just found the secret of life to everyone in the bar.
The secret of life.
And the truth wasn't far off. As Watson and Crick had solved a fundamental mystery of science and how it was possible for genetic instructions to be held inside organisms and passed from generation to generation. Now, I mean, this discovery has led to amazing things now. I mean, we're cloning, based on this technology. We're healing people based on this technology, and who knows where this technology will go. And some of that is controversial, but anyhow, pretty amazing to think about. Waking up one day on this day and discovering DNA.
DNA, indeed.
Which also happens to be an amazing song by Kendrick Lamar.
Hey, I'm with that too. I love Kendrick.
I mean, that song is
That's a good song, yeah.
It's such a good song. It's such a great video, too, with Don Cheadle. Have you seen it?
Yeah, of course.
Also on this day, in 1982, the Getty Museum becomes the most richly endowed museum on Earth when it receives a $1.2 billion bequest left by the late J. Paul Getty. He was the American oil billionaire, one of the oil billionaires. He died in 1976. But there was so much legal wrangling over his fortune by his children that, anyway, it took a few years for this to go through, apparently, um, which is so sad. You hear about that with Disney as well, and these other. I mean, Disney was such an amazing. He was an amazing man, really. To do all that he did, and have the influence and the imprint on America, on the world.
Right.
I mean, it's amazing.
Yeah.
It's amazing. I'm sure the man had his faults. Blah blah blah. He was somewhat a man of his times, etc. But still, he had vision. He had amazing creativity, and his children, his offspring, his extended family, have now sort of come to this place where it's all just squabbling over money.
Right.
It's such an unfortunate thing. Anyhow, on this day also was the day that the ATF raided the Waco compound, the Branch Davidian. Are you familiar?
No, I am not.
Ended in terrible tragedy where they accidentally. I mean, they were sort of throwing smoke bombs in to try and get him out, but it accidentally set the place on fire and burned everyone.
No.
It was terrible. Anyway, it was this sort of fringe cult that had this tragic end. But also on this day was the last episode of MASH. 11 seasons. This was 1983 on this day. Celebrated sitcom. It was a 2-hour special watched by 77% of the television viewing audience. 77%.
That's crazy.
Of the viewing audience at that time. It was the largest percentage ever to watch a single TV show. Anyhow, that's Common Ground today. Thank you so much for joining us. We want to thank our lovely sponsors, of course, Denny & Company, LLP, certified public accountants. They make your life less taxing. Reach out to Matt Denny for all your accounting needs at dennyllp.com, 661-286-8860. And, of course, the law offices of Lou Espin. When experience counts, count on experience at espinlaw.com or by calling 661-254-5050. Always want to thank my lovely engineer, Patty Oshwika, and, of course, Jerry and Carl, our owners here at KHTS, the amazing staff. Pleasure to have you here on Common Ground, where we can all agree on the important stuff.